Hello, this is Jeff Neville for Selective Imagery. If you'd like to skip ahead and go past my introductory slideshow, it kind of shows you folks what I like to take pictures of. Jump ahead to about the 1 minute and 45-second mark, and that should get you close to where we start the real deal here with the video. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Welcome to Selective Imagery. Welcome to Thanks for the Memories, Part 4. Again, to talk about some other vintage cameras that I have, a few that I've just recently acquired. And this is the top of the box, okay, for the first camera we're going to talk about. And that's the logo for Eastman Kodak Corporation. And in my previous video, the Kodak Vest pocket camera actually had that logo on the front of the camera. So it's kind of an interesting design. And the particular camera we're going to talk about first is the Baby Brownie. Oh, everybody knows about Brownie cameras, whether they're the box cameras or the ones made out of Bakelite. There were so many variations. This particular Baby Brownie, this is showing you how big the picture is going to be when you get it developed. And you know, you're lucky sometimes where you can get an old camera and you have the old box. I mean, I had to tape the flaps on that in a few spots. They were, you know, weren't in the best of shape. It had this little tag, you know, telling you to put it on your first roll of film when you send it into them. And it also had, luckily for me, a manual. Very small manual. And we'll just open it up here a little bit. And you can get an idea of what the manual looked like. So, you know, when you're lucky enough to get a camera that has documentation, manuals, the original box, that's a nice to have, and it does add value to what you buy. But, I mean, it all depends on the type of camera. Now, I'm going to just do you a quick view of the camera itself. Front view, side view, rear view, the other side, and the top. Now, obviously very, very small. This was introduced in the United States in 1934 and was produced until 1941. They had an export model, which was slightly different, that went to England, and I believe it came out a little bit later, and they stopped building it at a little bit later time frame as well. But the body itself, I mean, this is a Bakelite body which, you know, some of the Argus cameras were Bakelite bodies, and there were other brands of cameras that used Bakelite bodies as well. And Bakelite was commonly used in very early radios. So it was starting to become, you know, they looked at it as like an Art Deco thing. This is considered an Art Deco design that Walter Dorwin Teague did for Kodak. And he did Art Deco designs on quite a few of their cameras. He did it on the front faceplate on many of the Kodak Brownie box cameras that had different color patterns on the front, and he did it on some of the Bellows type cameras as well. Now, Walter Dorwin Teague, you know, read up on him. That's an interesting story in itself. But he did a lot of Art Deco design for Kodak on their cameras, and he did some gas station designs for Texaco, and he did a lot of work for a lot of other companies. So he was very well known in the day, as they say. Now, this camera, it's a fixed focus camera, fixed aperture. You can't adjust the f-stop, and you don't focus with it. Basically, it's supposedly going to have an image that's sharp as long as it's at least 5 feet away to infinity. Originally, this camera cost $1. Over 4 million copies of this camera were sold. Now, it uses 127 negative film, excuse me, which was the same that was used in the Kodak pocket vest camera that I talked about in my last video that I did. And so that's a negative that's 4.6 centimeters by 6.5 centimeters. And in inches, that's roughly 1.8 inches by 2.5 inches. And you would get 8 shots out of a roll of film. It has a spring rotary shutter. And in the manual, they only recommend using this camera in very good light. You got to use it, they specifically say, use it 2.5 hours after sunrise and stop using it 2.5 hours before sunset. And it has what's called a frame finder that you use for composition, which is in the back here. It lifts up. Okay, that's looking from the back. That's what you're going to be looking through. And you just use that as your guide to where you place your subject of interest within this frame. Now, most cameras in the early days weren't serialized, and this camera has no serialization on it at all. So I don't know if this was made in 1934 or 1941. All you know is that this particular model was made within that time frame, and that's about it. Now, the exported models to England had an extra button on the front of them called a brief time button, which was basically for long exposures. They did not have that on the USA model, and this is a USA model. The shutter release is a simple mechanical lever on the bottom. You can hear it. I'll move it closer. You can probably even see the spring in there. I don't know, but so that's it. So the film is loaded opposite the winder knob. This is the winder knob. So the film cartridge is on this side. And you would rotate the knob. You can hear it. Until the next picture number showed up in the red window on the rear of the camera. Now, one might ask, you know, why would you collect such a cheap camera? I mean, it's not a Leica, it's not a Voigtlander, it's not some, you know, high-end camera. Why bother with something like this? Well, the way I look at it, This camera sold over 4 million copies. Eastman Kodak deserves a lot of credit for getting, over the years, getting so many people interested in photography with cameras that the average person could afford to buy. So we all owe them a lot for that. And that's why I wanted this camera, because it tells a story. And I'll just open up the back. You know, you look at the bottom, there's a lever, and you rotate the lever, and it allows you to separate the area where you're going to put the film. So this is where you're feeding the end of the roll into this, and then you're winding it. And this is where you have a little metal clip, and this is where your roll of film is going to sit in here, and you basically pull the film across and put it in the slot, advance it a little bit, put the camera back together. I'm probably doing it the wrong way. No, I guess I had it right. Put the camera back together, lock the bottom, and just advance the lever till you see the number 1 in the back. Simple as that. So, you know, not worth $1 million by any means, but I like cameras that tell a story. And this camera and all cameras have a story. You just got to decide which ones mean enough to you to make you want to go out and actually buy it. So we'll move on to the next camera. So now we move on to camera number 2. Here's the box for camera number 2. And this is an old 1939 era Falcon Miniature half-frame camera. And I know what you're saying, half-frame, where does that come from? Well, basically, it's similar. It uses 127 film, which is the same film that was in the Baby Brownie, and the same film used in the Kodak Pocket Vest camera from my previous video. And so it's kind of like in the 35 millimeter days, you had the Olympus pen camera, the original Olympus pen camera, which was a half frame camera. So if you put in a 36 exposure roll with 35 millimeter film, you actually got 72 pictures out of it. So the 127 film, Kodak stopped making it in 1995, but then there are companies today that'll cut down a 120 roll film, which you could still buy, and they'll repurpose it and put it on a roll for 127, but the cost is very prohibitive. You know, B&H sells black and white film, 127 films, like a little over $20 a roll. The color is over $31 a roll. Really, to me, not worth it for these inexpensive cameras, unless you just want to just do it for kicks and try it out once. So a 4x6 camera will get you 8 exposures, but because this is a half frame camera, and here's what it looks like, we'll go over the looks in a second, you're going to get 4x3 images, so you get 16 images per roll. So I was shocked that they had half frame cameras back in the late 1930s, and that kind of blew me away, which made this camera interesting. Now look at the here's the front view. The only thing on the front is the shutter, and then you have an instantaneous mode and a time mode. So time mode is for long exposures. You know, hold the shutter down as long as you need to, and then let it go for it to close. So so that's the front view. There's the side view. Here's the back view, and this is the release lever to remove the back. But what's important here is you have 2 red lenses, which is typical of a lot of cameras back in the day, so that you could see what your film count was. You could know when you had advanced the film properly. You have one that's labeled A and one that's labeled B, and we'll get into that more in a minute. And the bottom actually does have a tripod mount, and even though this looks like it might be a collapsible lens, it is not. It fakes you out. It is not collapsible. It just sticks out like that all the time. Now, this camera was made by the Utility Manufacturing Company in New York. It's a Bakelite body, but very thin. Similar in styling to the more expensive Argus A series cameras, which were 35 millimeter. But this sold for $1, just like the Baby Brownie did. So here's a comparison. This is an Argus A series camera, and you can kind of see the resemblance in terms of the look. But this is obviously by far the better camera. You couldn't adjust the f-stops. It was a fixed aperture, spring rotary shutter, but it did have a glass optic in the front, which was a 50 millimeter mini bar lens. The shutter speeds, if you were in the instantaneous mode, was 1/25th of a second. And like I said, you had a time or bulb mode selection on the front of the lens. You had a simple optical finder for composition versus the frame finder that you had on the Baby Brownie. But there were a lot of different variations of this camera that were made, and some of them did have the frame finder in them, and I actually liked it better. I don't see very well through this, at least as being an eyeglass wearer. I mean, I'd rather have the frame finder, to be honest with you. And as I mentioned before, it has a tripod socket. Now, talking about the windows in the back, the A and the B, and we will get closer here so you can see them. When you first put the film in and you start winding it in place, you adjust the wind, you wind the wind knob until the number 1 appears in the center of window A, which is right here. You take your picture, you wind it a little bit more until that number 1 is in the center of window B, and you take a picture. Then you wind it a little more until number 2 is in the center of window A, and you keep going. Eventually, when you have the number 8 showing up in window B, you're done. You've taken 16 pictures at that point because it's a half-frame camera. Now, in the end, to me, this was just a very cheap imitation, trying to take advantage of the styling of the Argus series cameras. But it's half frame. But one of the coolest features is actually when you take the back off. So to take the back off, you have this release. You see how it's moving? And then I'll pull it off. You put your roll film in here. You pull the leader across. Okay, you put it in here, in the groove, and you advance it a little bit. Put the back on it, and continue to advance until you see the number 1 in the middle of the lens that's labeled A. But what's interesting is this extra compartment here. And you're like, well, what? If my film's going here, because here's the holding pins. There's no holding pins here. You go, what's that for? You put a spare unused roll of film in there, and that's what made this camera to me worth buying, because once again, it isn't that it's worth a lot of money, it isn't that it's hard to get, it's that it's unique and it tells a story. That's why I got this camera. So now we're going to move on to the third camera in this video. Okay, for our final camera, we're going to talk about a 1966 Petri V6 interchangeable lens 35mm SLR camera. And I'm going to show you it first, And and like I said, it's a V6 model. Doesn't mean there's a V6 under the hood unless you're Tim the Toolman Taylor and you manage to fit one in the camera body somehow. I don't think so. But here you go. Here's what it looks like. Here's the front of it. You got your PC sync. You have a mechanical shutter release. Your mechanical self timer. You have your shutter release up here, which is angled and on the front rather than on the top, which is actually pretty cool. It's a real nice location to have it. I mean, your finger fits here more naturally than it does up here. And you got these nubs on this machine that are on the front of the camera, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Bottom, nothing special. Button to allow you to rewind the film, and a tripod socket. Back, nothing overly exciting. You do have an accessory shoe on here that we'll talk about in a little bit. I don't like how they did it, and they did this on a lot of cameras. You look at the top, you got a rewind lever. You have to, when you rewind, it goes back, and then you have to push it in the rest of the way. You got your shutter speeds are B, half a second to 1/500th of a second. Now, this was considered a camera, was priced and meant for a beginner in photography for SLRs. Because apparently from what I've read, wasn't robust enough or accurate enough to allow them to have it go to 1/1000th of a second, which some of the higher end cameras did and were considered more professional cameras because of that. So this was basically dialed down to have a 1/500th of a second maximum shutter speed, and was for people that were starting out. And then you have a frame counter and your film rewind crank. The lens was a Petri 55mm 2.0. We'll talk about the lens a little more in a minute. We'll talk about Petri briefly as a camera company. It was founded in 1907. Japanese company. And they made decent cameras. They made good cameras. Behind me I have a Petri rangefinder camera. Excuse me. But they couldn't keep up in terms of manufacturing quantities with Canon, Minolta, or Nikon at the time. And then as cameras got more advanced, more electronics, circuit cards, stuff like that, like many other camera manufacturers, they just weren't able to adapt to the higher technology that was coming out. And a lot of camera companies ended up going bankrupt and disappearing. And in 1977, 1978 time frame, Petri was another manufacturer that went bankrupt. But they were the first Japanese company to make an SLR camera, 1959. And they provided lenses as OEMs to a lot of other camera manufacturers, including lenses that went into some of the Nikon rangefinder cameras. Now, this was one of the last bodies that they made in their own manufacturing facility, and eventually they farmed it out to Cosina. Started making some of their bodies with the Petri name on it near the end of their existence. Now, it doesn't have a depth of field button on it, but it has a weird feature on the lens that you rotate from an automatic diaphragm. I don't know if you could see the word auto there. Okay, so you rotate the ring, and it goes from automatic diaphragm to manual, and that's basically like a depth of field preview. So when you have your f-stop set, say at f8, and you want to see how much is in focus, you can move that lever and put it in manual diaphragm control, and you can see how much of the image is going to be in focus. But when you put the lens on, you also have to have it in that manual mode when you put the lens on the camera. Flash sync was 1/45 of a second. When you look through the viewfinder, all you see is what's called a micro lens Fresnel screen to aid in focusing. It has no information. It's a completely manual camera. There's no battery. You don't have any window cutouts to show you what, so that you can look through the viewfinder and see what the shutter speed is or your f-stop. You got to take your eye off the camera to set it up. Completely manual. No exposure meter system in it as standard, but we'll talk about that a little more in a second. You could buy a clip-on CDS exposure meter system that went on this camera and basically slides down over these two pins on the front of the body. And I have one here. This is what it looks like. And we'll talk about it more in a few minutes. Now I'm going to take the lens off quick because something that's interesting is it looks like a bayonet mount, and it is and it isn't. It's actually a breech mount system. You don't stick it in the body and rotate it to the right or rotate it to the left and that's it, okay? You have on the body a ring. Okay, you can see the red line right in the middle. Okay, you have a corresponding red line on the lens. So you have to have it in that manual diaphragm preset format with the ring adjustment. Align the red arrows. Align the red arrows. I'll lift it up a little bit. See the red? Okay. Make sure it's in there, and then you tighten the ring, the breech lock ring. And that's how you put the lens on. I actually like this design. They had this on the Canon FD mount, used the breech lock system. And actually, with today's modern cameras, whether they're mirrorless or high-end digital SLRs, one of the biggest problems is the electrical contacts. How many times, I mean, I had to have my flange mount replaced on my D850 because I was having intermittent connectivity with the electronics with my lenses. They had to replace it. Even a modern mirrorless camera, I don't care what brand it is, doesn't matter. Every lens you put on that body, some are really tight, some have a little wobble in them. And sometimes you start getting intermittent connections. You wobble the lens a little, all of a sudden the meter's working right, or some function's working right. You wiggle it a little bit too much the other way and then it doesn't work anymore. This breech lock system isn't a bad idea. I mean, once if you had electrical contacts on this on both ends, at both ends, once you put that lens in and you tighten up that collar, there is no movement. You're going to have perfect connections. I almost wish they had that. I mean, they probably got rid of it because it wasn't as quick to change lenses out. And this lens goes from f2 to f16. But I think that's kind of a design that I kind of like. I'll let you hear what the shutter sounds like here quick. That's at 1/125th of a second. And this camera did not work at slow shutter speeds when I got it. I had to fix it, so luckily I was able to fix it. And you have an auto reset frame counter, so when you rewind the film and you pop the back off, it resets to 0 or start automatically. Okay, so I'm going to do a separate clip here talking about the CDS meter. because this is the second time recording this because the thing timed out on me for whatever reason, so I'm going to split it up into two parts here. So I'm going to show you the CDS clip-on exposure meter that you could buy as an accessory, which I picked up from a different vendor. Here's a view of it from the top. You have your shutter speed dial, you have your exposure meter settings, you have f-stops listed, you have a window for DIN number or your ASA number. If I get closer, you could probably barely see the red indicator arrow here, which will move based on the light hitting the front of the sensor. And then you would follow that through these paths, and it would indicate to you what f-stop to use. So you have an H off, an L for low, H for high, switch on the front. And you start off with it on high if you have decent lighting, and in a low light situation you switch it to low. And when you're not using the camera, you turn it off so you don't waste the battery. Then you look at the bottom, then you have your opening for putting your battery in. And this is important to have this little groove here, because when you go and put this on the camera, that groove is going to cradle that pin that sticks up from your shutter speed knob, so it aligns it. So you're actually going to be changing the shutter speed from the exposure meter, and that pin will rotate this so it matches. So we're going to put it on the camera now. You push in this little lever on the side, and let's see, how do we do this? And you're going to slide it over the pins. So I'm just going to see if I could, I don't know if I could really do it. We're going to try. We're going to try. No, it ain't going to work. I'm just going to do it where I could see what the heck I'm doing. Okay. You can see it has a locking mechanism that goes around the pin, and the other one, it just sits there. So now it's mounted. Then you rotate the upper dial until it falls in between that pin. And now you can rotate your shutter speed, and it will move the dial underneath because you got that pin. Okay? And then this is where you turn this top wheel to adjust your ASA. It's best to do it once you have it mounted to the camera. And that's it. So, you know, you take your light, you set your shutter speed to what you want it to be. You read the needle. You determine what your f-stop has to be based on what you set for your ASA, or ISO. Nowadays they call it ISO. And you adjust your f-stop on your camera, you know, accordingly. You focus and you take your picture. So that's about it. And there were many brands of cameras that had optional exposure meters. I mean, they even had it on the twin lens reflex cameras of the Raleigh Flexes or other TLRs in the day. And now eventually, you know, in terms of the in terms of the Raleigh Flex, they eventually had a selenium meter, a selenium cell as part of their exposure metering system. The problem is if you buy anything that old that has selenium cells, they don't hold up, they don't last. You buy anything from the 50s that have those, or if you're going to buy a vintage camera that has those selenium cells, do it knowing that more than likely it won't work. The person selling it probably doesn't even know whether it works or not. And they'll say, well, when I hold it up to a light bulb, it does move a little bit, but you don't know what the accuracy, and it probably isn't going to be very accurate. So just assume if you want that old vintage camera that has a selenium cell in it, that if you're actually going to use the camera, you need to do a comparison between what the camera's telling you to use for settings with that selenium cell that you think might still work, and compare it to a handheld meter and see how close it is. Decide whether or not it's accurate enough to use. So talking about the accessory shoe a little bit more, what I don't like about these types of shoes is they slide on. I'm going to pull it up halfway. They slide down in a groove that's part of that eyepiece. They're not the only camera manufacturer that did this. The Olympus Pen series of cameras, half-frame 35mm cameras, had the same type of thing. You go and look at a used pen camera, eBay, wherever you want to look, and the outer edge of these viewfinder frames are either chipped off, cracked, or half of it's missing. Because if I bump this camera right now with this on it, the weakest point is this plastic material, and that's going to give before anything else. Now, what eventually happened, and I'll get a different camera completely. Let's see, where did I put it? Olympus OM1, 35mm camera. Optional hot shoe. Wasn't built into the Pentaprism like a more modern SLR. It was an optional accessory. And you can see here where it cradles the Pentaprism. It doesn't slide down in a groove around that eyepiece. So at least they got smart enough where you weren't going to wreck the eyepiece, but you actually had a tapped hole, you know, in your Pentaprism of your camera, and you lay this thing on top, and you would turn this wheel, and it would basically spin that screw into the body. And that's how they did it. And then years later, you know, you didn't have these as accessories anymore. They were built into the bodies. They were part of the cameras. So you could see the progression of what they started out with, you know, whether it be the Pen 35mm camera or this old Petri with a slide-on cold shoe. It wasn't even a hot shoe. It was a cold shoe. So you had to hook your flash sync up with a cable, plug it into this. So that's about it. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't subscribed. I'd appreciate it. And once again, my slogan is enjoy life, capture some of it, get out there with whatever camera you choose to use. Vintage, film, SLR, DSLR, whatever you have, whatever makes you happy, get out there and use it, and have a good time. So take care, everybody. Until next time.